The shot rang across the training field and echoed in the hills beyond, and everyone thought it was another mistake from her rifle, and another wasted round from the girl, who could not shoot, and the bullet hit a large rock far away from the target. And a wave of laughter erupted among the recruits, and they shouted that she had missed by a mile, and that she should pack her bags and leave before embarrassing herself further, and the mocking voices carried in the open air like a cruel chorus. That seemed louder than the gunshot itself, but then silence fell as the target that was hidden behind cover suddenly sparked, and a plume of smoke rose from the electronic panel that now blinked red with the signal of elimination, and every eye on the field froze in disbelief, and one instructor dropped his pen and whispered in a shaky voice that it was impossible, and another leaned forward with wide eyes as the realization spread slowly across the group like fire spreading in dry grass. They had mocked her for weeks and called her useless and said she had no place among trained shooters, but now they stared in stunned silence, and one voice finally broke through saying she aimed wrong but hit right, and another muttered she bent the bullet like magic, but it was not magic, and it was not luck, because what they had just witnessed was the very first controlled ricochet they had ever seen in their lives. The girl lowered her rifle slowly, and her face did not show pride or victory, but calm focus, as if she had already calculated this outcome long before she even pulled the trigger, and her sharp eyes scanned the range once more as if she was measuring the angles and surfaces and confirming what her mind had drawn earlier. Like a hidden map of physics that only she could see, her name was Elena Kraus, and she was 25 years old, and though her frame was lean and quiet, she carried the presence of someone who saw the world in numbers and trajectories rather than laughter and doubt, and her brown hair was tied back neatly so it would never block her vision, and her pale hands held the rifle with steady confidence, though every person around her had sworn she was the weakest of the group. Elena was not like the others, and she was not a soldier who had seen war zones or carried scars of battle, and she had not learned to shoot by fighting enemies in deserts or jungles, but instead, she came from the silent halls of a university where she studied structures, and the way forces moved through stone and steel, and how impact changed direction, depending on angles and materials, and she knew equations better than she knew commands, and she knew diagrams better than she knew combat drills. Others called her the book girl and the paper soldier, and they said she was wasting her time in a world that belonged only to veterans and warriors, and even the instructors doubted her and spoke quietly about her chances of failing and being removed before the program ended, and every step she took seemed heavier because of the mocking eyes around her, yet she walked steady because she carried a reason that none of them knew. That reason was hidden in her notebook, where she drew lines across blank pages late at night while the others slept, and in those lines were equations of angles and sketches of ricochets and calculations of how bullets could bounce from one surface to another and reach places thought impossible. And on the first page of that notebook she had written a single name, Daniel, and below it the words for him. Daniel was her brother, and he had been a soldier, and he had died on a mission when a hidden sniper killed him from behind cover that no one could reach, and Elena had read the report and knew that conventional training had failed him because no shot could reach behind the stone, and she swore that if physics offered another way she would find it, and she would master it no matter how many people laughed in her face. So while the others aimed straight and memorized wind tables, she studied the ground and the barriers and the rocks that surrounded the training fields, and she wrote down how different materials reacted when struck, and how moisture changed the bounce, and how the smallest angle could alter the path. And the others thought she was wasting time, but in truth she was building a secret weapon that required patience more than speed, and calculation more than muscle. And now on this day, when laughter had filled the air after her shot stone, the world had witnessed her truth, and the impossible had become possible, and silence was the only sound left on the range, because Elena had shown them that sometimes the bullet does not need to fly straight to find its mark, and sometimes the person you mock is the very one Who can see the angle that no one else dares to imagine? And, as the smoke curled from the destroyed target and the red light blinked again and again, the recruits realized that the girl they had dismissed had just changed everything they thought they knew about shooting, and the silence that followed was not respect yet, but shock and fear, and the beginning of a story that would spread far beyond the walls of this training field, because Elena Krauss had just proven that the path to a target does not always move in a line, but sometimes bends like the will of the one who refuses to give up. The silence on the range did not last long, and soon whispers rose among the recruits, and the instructors, and the disbelief turned into murmurs of confusion and denial, and one voice shouted that it must have been luck, and another said that maybe the target was faulty, and someone else argued that no one could plan a bounce like that, and yet the evidence was there, blinking red with smoke rising, and Alina standing still with her rifle calm and steady, and her eyes quiet like she had expected this reaction. But after the shot, the mocking did not stop for good, because in the days that followed, the recruits returned to their usual habits, and the laughter came back louder and sharper, as if they wanted to erase the memory of what had happened. And they told each other that the girl could never repeat it, and that she had only gotten lucky one time, and that real soldiers needed more than one miracle to be trusted. And so they called her ghost shooter and paper soldier, and told her she was wasting everyone's time during meals. They pointed at her notebook and made jokes about how she was drawing cartoons instead of learning to shoot, and one tall recruit named Marcus laughed that if bullets were math problems, maybe Elena would pass, and the others joined him and slapped the tables, and Sarah, the veteran Marine, added that in real combat there are no second chances and no diagrams, and that book tricks get you killed, and the room roared with cruel laughter again, while Elena sat silent and wrote in her notebook as if none of it mattered. But when she was alone, the weight pressed down on her shoulders, and in the quiet of her room, she would run her fingers over the name written on the first page, Daniel, and she would remember his smile and his words before he left for his final mission. And he had told her, "You see things others don't, and maybe one day it will matter." And now every insult from her peers only reminded her why she was here and why she could not quit. No matter how heavy the burden became, Elena was different from the others, and her days were not spent in simple repetition of drills, but in watching how the wind carried dust across the ground, and how the sunlight struck the edges of stone, and how sound echoed between walls. And she treated the training field like a puzzle with hidden answers, and while the others polished their rifles, she drew sketches of rocks and walls and tested small calculations with coins and pebbles, bouncing across surfaces to confirm her theories in the simplest ways. The instructors saw her effort, but they did not understand her purpose, and they marked her performance as average, and wrote notes that she lacked the natural instinct of a sniper, and that she might not belong in the program. And one instructor even pulled her aside and told her gently that some people are made for this and some are not, and that maybe her talent was better used in engineering rather than in the field where lives depended on instinct and speed. And Elena nodded quietly but did not stop her work. The truth was that Elena had no natural instinct for direct shooting, and her aim was only good enough to pass and never good enough to impress. And she knew this, but she also knew something the others did not know, because she believed that the battlefield was not limited to direct lines, and that if a bullet could bounce, then a bullet could reach a place where instinct alone would fail. And she believed that physics could open doors where talent closed them, and that one perfect ricochet could save soldiers when straight shots failed. She continued her strange path, and while Marcus boasted about his combat tours and Sarah told stories of desert raids, Elena quietly tested angles and filled pages with numbers, and the more they mocked her, the more determined she became. And she reminded herself each night that Daniel had died because no one believed in angles and no one trusted a bullet to bend, and she promised that his death would not remain in vain, and that one day she would make the world see what he had seen in her. Days moved on, and the training grew harder, and the targets farther, and the conditions harsher. And while The others grew sharper and quicker. Alina seemed to remain steady, but not excellent, and she did not rise on the leaderboard, and her scores did not shine, and this made her an easy target for whispers that she was falling behind, and soon the rumor spread that she would not last until the final test and that she would be sent home before the program ended. But in her silence, she carried a fire that the others could not see, and she wrote each number with patience and each sketch with care, and each calculation with love for the brother who had believed in her, and she practiced until her hands were raw and her eyes burned with exhaustion, and even when doubt crept into her own heart, she forced herself to remember Daniel's last words, and she whispered them to herself before sleep like a promise carved into stone. Girl they mocked was not a fighter in the way they defined fighting, but she was something else entirely, and though they could not see it yet, she was building a weapon inside her mind that would one day silence every laugh and prove that the battlefield is not only about strength, but also about vision and patience and belief in what others dismiss as impossible. And Elena Krauss was not preparing for approval or recognition, but for a moment that would decide whether her brother's death would remain a tragedy or become the spark of change. The night was quiet in the barracks, and the soft hum of the lamps filled the silence as Elena sat at her desk with her small black notebook open and her pencil moving quickly across the pages, and while the other recruits slept with their rifles cleaned and ready, she drew strange lines that curved and twisted across diagrams of rocks and walls and bullets, bouncing like arrows on invisible paths, and she wrote numbers beside each line, as if she was solving a secret puzzle that no one else dared to understand. On one page she wrote the word Daniel in careful strokes, and circled it twice, and below it she wrote "Angles never lie," and then she continued drawing a new sketch that showed a bullet striking a stone at a sharp corner and bouncing toward a target that was hidden behind cover, and she whispered softly to herself, calculating the force and the distance and the loss of speed, as if she was speaking to her brother, who had once told her, "You always see things others miss every day." The training grew more difficult, and the instructors added new challenges with strong winds in longer ranges and moving targets, and while Marcus and Sarah competed loudly for top scores, Elena seemed to remain in the shadows with her steady but average hits, and the scoreboard never placed her high enough to attract attention. But when the others laughed, she simply lowered her eyes and waited for the night when she could return to her notebook and build her secret world of angles and physics. One evening during a storm, she walked alone to the empty range after hours and stood under the flickering lights with her rifle, and she placed a few stones in the dirt and marked them with chalk, and then she fired a single round at the first stone, and the bullet bounced and struck another stone and then skipped into the soft soil just short of her chalk mark, and she adjusted the angle in her notebook and whispered, "Too shallow," and then fired again, and this time the bullet curved closer to the mark. The rain fell harder and soaked her hair, but she did not stop, and she repeated the process over and over until her shoulders ached and her fingers trembled, and finally she hit the chalk mark exactly after the bounce, and she smiled faintly in the darkness because she knew it was working, and she wrote in her notebook for Daniel and for everyone who thought this was impossible, and then she packed up the stones and returned before anyone noticed her experiment. The next morning, Sarah saw her notebook by accident and snorted with laughter as she flipped through the pages and said, "Look at this. She thinks bullets are balls on a pool table," and the recruits gathered and laughed with her, and Marcus added, "Maybe next time she will try bouncing them off the moon," and they roared with cruel amusement, and Alina simply took the notebook back without a word and closed it gently as if protecting something sacred, and she walked away while the sound of their laughter followed her down the hall. But inside her heart the laughter did not break her, and instead it hardened her resolve, and she remembered how Daniel had believed in her strange ways of thinking, and how he had once told her that innovation always looks like madness until it saves someone, and she whispered those words to herself again and promised that she would hold on no matter how heavy the doubt became, because one day her calculations would matter, and one day the bullets would prove her Right, the instructors continued to watch her with puzzled eyes, because they saw her hit targets with quiet consistency, but never with speed or brilliance, and they saw her notes, filled with diagrams that looked more like engineering blueprints than shooting tips, and one instructor asked her why she wasted so much energy on drawings, and she answered simply that everything follows principles, and if you understand them, you can find paths others do not see, and the instructor shook his head and said nothing more. Weeks passed, and the tension grew as the final test drew closer, and the recruits trained harder than ever, and Marcus bragged that he would take the top spot, and Sarah promised that she would outshoot them all, and the others cheered for their own chances. But Alina kept silent and wrote in her notebook until the margins were filled with equations, and her eyes burned from sleepless nights, and on one page she wrote in bold letters, "The bounce will work when nothing else does." Her secret practice gave her confidence, but she still carried doubt in her chest because she knew she had only tested small bounces at short range, and the final test would be at extreme distance and under harsh conditions, and failure could mean the end of her training and the end of her promise to Daniel. And sometimes when she lay awake, she wondered if she was only chasing shadows, and if the others were right to laugh at her. But then she would open the notebook and see his name, and she would know she could not stop. The girl they mocked was not chasing pride or rank, but chasing a vision of a bullet that could bend around obstacles and strike where no one else could reach, and each mark in her notebook was another step toward that vision. And though the recruit saw only weakness, she was slowly shaping a weapon that could rewrite the rules of battle, and the storm inside her was not fear, but the fire of a promise that had not yet been fulfilled. And soon the day would come when the world would see what her equations truly meant. The morning of the final test arrived with cold winds sweeping across the range, and the recruits stood in a straight line with rifles ready and faces tense, because this was the day that would decide who stayed and who left. And the instructors explained the rules with stern voices, and the challenge was simple on paper, but impossible in practice, because the target was hidden behind a thick wall of concrete, and no direct shot could ever reach it, and the distance stretched more than a mile, and the wind howled like an enemy determined to push every bullet off course. One by one the recruits stepped forward and fired, and each believed their skill would break the impossible. And Marcus went first with a proud grin, and he adjusted carefully and squeezed the trigger with perfect form, and his bullet slammed into the concrete barrier and shattered harmlessly, and he cursed it under his breath and tried again, but the second round failed as well, and his grin vanished as the scoreboard flashed miss, and the others whispered that maybe the test was not fair. Sarah stepped up next, and her confidence filled the air, and she aimed high as if to arc her shot over the wall, but the bullet passed harmlessly above the hidden target and disappeared into the distance, and she tightened her jaw and fired again. But the result was the same, and frustration spread across her face as the scoreboard marked another miss, and the instructors began to murmur among themselves about whether the test was too harsh. Each recruit tried in turn, and each failed with the same result, and the air grew heavy with disappointment and tension, and whispers spread that maybe this was a trick and that the instructors only wanted to see everyone fail, and some began to mutter that the challenge was not about skill, but humiliation, and the silence between shots grew longer as the confidence drained from the group, and hope turned into frustration. Finally, after 15 failed attempts, the chief instructor raised his hand to pause the test, and he spoke quietly to his colleagues about whether the parameters should be changed, and the recruits shifted nervously, and Marcus shouted that no one could pass such a test, and Sarah added that it was a waste of time, and everyone agreed until a calm voice spoke from the back of the line, and Alina stepped forward with her rifle steady in her hands. The recruits laughed again, and Marcus called out that she should not even bother, because if the best could not do it, then the weakest had no chance, and Sarah smirked and said maybe she would draw a diagram first before firing, and the laughter rolled across the field again. But Alina did not react, and she walked slowly to the firing position and lay flat on the ground with her notebook beside her rifle and her eyes Sharp as she studied the terrain, she did not aim at the hidden target, but at the rocky outcrop far to the right, and the observers frowned and shook their heads, because it looked like she had given up before even trying. And one instructor whispered that she was aiming at the wrong place, and another muttered that maybe she had broken under the pressure, and Marcus shouted again that she was making a fool of herself, and Sarah laughed loudly, but Alina stayed calm and adjusted her scope with small, precise movements. She breathed slowly and counted the wind gusts and measured the distance with her eyes, and in her mind she saw the path of the bullet as a line bouncing from stone to soil and finally into the hidden target. And she whispered softly for Daniel, and then pulled the trigger. And the sharp crack echoed across the range as the bullet sped away and smashed into the rocky surface exactly where she had aimed, and for a moment, everyone thought it was a complete miss. Then, less than a second later, the hidden target exploded in smoke and sparks, and the scoreboard flashed "Target eliminated," and silence swept across the field like a wave. And every recruit froze in disbelief, and the instructors leaned forward with wide eyes, and the chief instructor dropped his clipboard as the impossible truth settled in, and one spotter shouted, "She planned it, she aimed for the rock, she made the bullet bounce." The laughter died instantly, and the recruits stared with mouths open, and Marcus muttered, "No way," and Sarah whispered it was luck, but deep down they knew it was not luck, and the silence grew heavier as the smoke curled upward from the destroyed target, and Elena lowered her rifle calmly and closed her notebook with a steady hand, and her eyes glowed not with pride, but with quiet relief. Because she had done what she came here to do, the instructors rushed to review the footage and watched frame by frame as the bullet struck the rock at a perfect angle, skipped across the soft ground that slowed its speed, and entered the hidden zone with deadly precision, and the analysts confirmed in stunned voices that it was intentional and repeatable. And the chief instructor turned to the recruits and said, "In 30 years I have never seen this before. This is not luck, this is vision." The range remained silent, except for the sound of the wind, and the recruits who had mocked her lowered their eyes, and none dared to laugh anymore, because they had just witnessed a new kind of shot, and Elena had proven that the battlefield is not only for strength, but also for those who can see angles where others see walls, and her ricochet had stunned the range silent. The smoke still drifted above the shattered target, and the silence stretched so long that every recruit could hear the wind rushing through the trees, and no one dared to speak because they had all seen something that should not have been possible, yet had just unfolded before their eyes, and the girl they mocked had turned their laughter into disbelief with a single shot. And as the scoreboard blinked again and again with the red mark of elimination, the instructors finally broke the silence. With hushed voices, one instructor whispered she controlled the bounce, and another said, "I did not believe it until now," and the chief instructor shook his head slowly and said, "This is a first in my career, because no recruit has ever used physics like this," and he called the technical team to review the footage once more, and the experts confirmed what everyone already knew, and they explained that the angle was exact, and the loss of speed was calculated, and the bullet had obeyed her design. Like a path drawn by hand across the air, Elena stood quietly as they spoke, and she did not smile, and she did not seek their praise, and instead, she opened her notebook and placed her pencil inside and closed it softly with the name Daniel still visible on the first page. And when one of the instructors asked her how she had done it, she answered simply, "I studied the rocks, I measured the angles, I trusted the bounce," and then she turned away as if the explanation needed nothing more. The recruits looked at her with new eyes, and Marcus, who had once mocked her, lowered his gaze and could not speak, and Sarah crossed her arms tightly and muttered that maybe it was luck, but her voice shook as she said it, and deep down even she knew it was not luck, because no luck lasts through such precision, and no miracle repeats itself under control. And though their pride kept them from admitting it, they all understood that Elena had changed what it meant to shoot. News of the shot spread beyond the range within hours, and officers from higher command arrived to see the footage and to questioned Elena about her methods, and she explained again, in simple words, that physics does not lie, and that bullets can travel paths if you know how to guide them. And one colonel said this could save lives, and another nodded and said we must learn this. And they all asked if she would teach others, and Elena agreed, but only if the training carried the name of her brother, who had believed in her first weeks. Later, new recruits were introduced to a different kind of lesson, and Elena stood before them with her rifle and her notebook, and she showed them that sometimes the shortest path is not straight, and she told them that patience and vision are as powerful as speed and instinct, and she taught them to trust in angles and in preparation. And though many failed to learn the skill, a few began to understand, and each one who succeeded carried a piece of her promise forward. For Elena, the medals and the praise meant little, because her victory was not for herself, but for Daniel, and she kept his memory alive in every lecture and every demonstration. And she told the recruits that the world will laugh at you until the day you prove them wrong, and that sometimes the only way to honor the people you love is to do the thing they believed you could do. And her quiet voice carried more weight than the loudest speeches, because every student knew she had lived those words. Her Ricochet technique soon reached the battlefield, and special units began to test it in real combat, and reports came back that soldiers trapped behind cover were saved when bullets bent around obstacles, and threats that had once been untouchable were removed with a single bounce, and commanders wrote that the impossible had become possible, and each success was a living echo of her first shot at the range. When silence fell and laughter died, but Elena herself remained the same quiet figure with her notebook never far from reach, and her eyes always calculating as she walked the training fields. And she never claimed to be a hero, and she never demanded respect, because she believed the shot belonged not to her, but to everyone who dared to think differently. And every time she opened her notebook and saw the name Daniel, she felt the same calm as when she pulled the trigger that day, and she knew she had kept her promise. The recruits who once mocked her began to tell her story in whispers to new students. And they spoke of the girl who aimed at a rock and hit a hidden target, and they admitted that she had stunned them all into silence, and they warned never to laugh at someone who sees the world in another way, because one day that vision may save lives. And her legacy grew not only through her students, but through the lesson that innovation often wears the disguise of foolishness until it proves itself. Years later, when the training ground walls repainted, the instructors added a simple phrase above the firing line, and it read, "Sometimes a miss is the perfect shot," and those words became the motto of a new program, designed to teach recruits that creativity and courage matter as much as accuracy and speed. And Elena's name was written quietly in the records, not with glory, but with respect, and every soldier who trained under that program carried a part of her story. And so Elena Krauss, the girl they mocked and called Paper Soldier, became the one who rewrote the rules of marksmanship, not with strength, but with vision, and not with pride, but with patience. And the ricochet that stunned the range silent lived on as a lesson that sometimes the impossible becomes real when someone refuses to give up, and when someone dares to aim where no one else dares to aim. And her story reminds us all that, even when the world laughs, the right angle can turn silence into victory.